Thank you for joining us. This is Brave New History. We're here with Edward Dodge. Let's see, talking about matriarchy in the Bible. And yeah, what do we know about? Thank you for joining us. And yeah, what do we know about matriarchy?
Great. Hey, Elliot, thanks for having me. It's great to be here. And yeah, so we're talking about the goddesses of the Old Testament, Asherah and matriarchy in the Old Testament. Basically, so I wrote a book called A History of the Goddess from the Ice Age to the Bible. And I've been developing that work further. I've got a blog. It's edwarddodge.substack.com if anyone wants to check it out, where I'm continuing to explore these themes and a little more, developing the scholarship on it. And basically what I've been digging into is the notion that the goddesses and the main reason why they get rid of them, and that's really the issue, is that they represent these old matriarchal traditions that get replaced by patriarchy. We're led to believe, generally, we're culturally conditioned to believe that patriarchy just sort of goes back forever, that men have been dominating women since caveman times, that just through sheer force of violence, men have been dominating women. We have these images in cartoons. We get these cartoons of men bashing women over the head with a club, dragging them home to have their way with them, as though this is how primitive people formed relationships. I really don't think that's true. I don't think there's any evidence for that at all. It's just a cultural trope that we're given. Likewise, a lot of people will say, more scholarly types will say that patriarchy goes back to the Neolithic Revolution and the dawn of agriculture some 10,000 years ago, 12,000 years ago. And then again, that these settled planting communities required men to dominate women. Again, I don't see any evidence for that in burial practices specifically, where as far as we can tell, there's no evidence at all of like kings or men that had, basically the men and women get buried the same. They would appear to have the same diets. They get buried with equal respect, with the same kind of possessions. Like people get buried with personal possessions in the Neolithic, but no one's buried with treasure. There's no class hierarchy in the Neolithic. There's no evidence that there was a ruling class or that anybody lived better than the other people in their community. As far as we can tell in that era, and it's a long era, we're talking some 6,000 years or more, people lived in pretty egalitarian societies where men and women had equal rights and they would have different responsibilities, mind you. It's not that everybody lived the same. There were still gender roles based on biology and based on the fact that women are caring for children. Meanwhile, the men are stronger and more mobile. So women, when they've got babies, when they're pregnant and lactating and caring for young children, they're not that mobile. They can't range far afield. Whereas the men are perfectly free to roam around. So the men would go on the hunting expeditions, and the men would go fight with the other men from a rival tribe or go on a trade expedition to find resources. Whereas the women would be maintaining the village, maintaining the home, so to speak. And as far as we can tell, that is the dominant way people live for the whole Neolithic. And it's the way we see indigenous people living into modern times. In the colonial era, we see these same kind of practices being people living this way. And it was widely discussed. Native Americans, when the Europeans arrived in Americas, they were finding Native Americans living this way. They'd observed it in the South Pacific with the Islanders and elsewhere around the world. I'm not an expert on indigenous people. It's not my field of study to say anything more than these sort of broad generalities. But there's a couple key things that we see, a couple really important details in terms of how the societies were structured that create the conditions for equal rights, and that we can observe in the older parts of the biblical narrative, and that we can observe changing. And these things, aside from just a sort of general egalitarianism, are matrilineality, which means family lines and bloodlines are tracked through the mother and not through the father. So matrilineal instead of patrilineal. In the modern patriarchal world, we track our families through the fathers. And when you track your bloodlines to the fathers, that obligates the entire society to control women's sex lives. You have to police women's sex lives to make sure that so that way you can control for paternity. If the women are, are promiscuous, then you don't know who the baby daddy is. But if you've got matrilineal cultures, it really doesn't matter. And this was widely observed. It's widely observed the Native Americans and the South Pacific that these cultures with matrilineal bloodlines have much more, perhaps promiscuous. They may or may not be promiscuous because every culture is different. Everyone's got their own customs and etiquette. And again, I'm not trying to generalize too much about any given culture, but it's widely observed that matrilineal indigenous cultures have more sexual freedom for women. This is like not really controversial. It's subject to a lot of anthropological research, and it was again a wide topic of conversation when the Europeans arrived and started interacting with the Native Americans. So that's one. Number two is matrilocal marriages as opposed to patrilocal, and what that means is that when you get married in a matrilocal marriage, when you get married, you go live with the husband goes and lives with the wife's family. In a patrilocal marriage, the wife is going to go live with the husband's family. And so if it's a happy marriage, it just doesn't really make too much of a difference. But if it's an unhappy marriage, it makes all the difference in the world, because in an unhappy marriage or a divorce, the woman has never left home. She has stayed with her family the entire time, with their generational wealth, with her extended kin. And if there's a divorce, they send the man packing, and the woman stays put. She never leaves. In the reverse, in a patrilocal marriage, if the woman is in the husband's family and the husband's abusive or just unhappy for whatever reason, and the woman's got children, she is very constrained in her ability to leave. And this is something we observe. We totally observe this in the modern world that, and once women get married in patriarchal marriages and they've got little kids, it's very difficult for them to leave. I mean, it's not to say it's impossible, but it's very hard. Another aspect of these types of marriages is that they were often practiced as what they call visiting marriages, meaning that they didn't really live together permanently. The man would come and visit for a while and then go back home, and they'd come and go, and they may or may not be an active father figure for their biological children. Again, it's widely observed that in these types of marriages, the father figure might be an uncle or a grandfather or just some other male from the kin group of the woman. And so that's number two. And then number three, related to all these things, is just the sexual freedom. The idea that the husband and the sperm donor can be totally separate people, and that no one's concerned about it. And again, this relates back to the matrilineal bloodlines and the fact that, so it just doesn't matter. You're not controlling for paternity, so you don't care if the girl is a virgin before she gets married, and you don't necessarily care if she's non-monogamous during the marriage. And these are things that we can observe in Bible stories. So I just wrote an article. I just published it on the Substack. Just came out. I published it last night, I guess. And so I'm introducing these themes. In the future articles, I'm going to get into the actual Bible stories where we can see this stuff. And one of my big themes that I'm developing here is that when we get into the Old Testament prophets, when they're castigating the women for their sex lives, and going on, the Hebrew prophets go on and on about how slutty all these women are and how horrible they are, and how they're having sex all over the place and having these sex rituals, and the men and women are all practicing adultery, and the children are all illegitimate. Hosea, Isaiah, Ezekiel, it goes on and on and on about all this stuff. In quite graphic terms. Some of these stories in the Bible are, pretty graphic about the sexual encounters of the women. And I spent a long time, trying to suss this out for myself. Like, how did this work? Because, like, you don't see this in the modern world. You don't see an entire society where everybody's non-monogamous. And so I had always sort of assumed that the biblical, the Hebrew prophets, the biblical writers were just being insulting, that they were just sort of making stuff up and, just hurling insults at these people. But I finally figured out that they're really just, when you get past the vitriol, they're really just describing an indigenous culture. They're really just describing people with matrilineal bloodlines, and that when you get past, the sort of the heated rhetoric, they're just describing indigenous people, and they're just describing the kind of stuff that they was totally observed in the South Pacific when these British ship captains would arrive in these islands and in the South Pacific, and the girls were just like, when their fathers would encourage them to have sex with these white men because the white men were so unusual, they were seen as like a prize to these islanders, and the British were like, "What is going on? I'll take it, but like I don't understand it at all." And they were, and the same thing with Native Americans. There's loads of stories about, especially in the early generations. Later on, it goes away, right? Later on, they stopped doing it, but in the 1600s, when all the encounters between the white man and the natives are all still pretty fresh and also getting to know each other, they weren't the white devil just yet. The sex was pretty wide open, and again, the Europeans were shocked by all this behavior, and they didn't really understand it, and frankly, they did not approve of it either. I mean, they would take it, right? But they didn't approve of it, and certainly the Christian priests and the missionaries didn't approve of it at all. And so the missionaries would try and tell them that all this behavior is terribly immoral. But it makes perfect sense when you just realize that they have matrilineal bloodlines, and they simply don't care. They don't care about paternity. They have zero concern at all about paternity whatsoever. They don't care. So if a girl gets pregnant and comes home and has a baby, her father doesn't mind. Her brothers aren't concerned. And and she doesn't get slut shamed. She doesn't get thrown out of the family for getting pregnant in what we would call an illegitimate pregnancy. And I think that that's what we're observing in the Old Testament with the prophets and with the Canaanites. And it gets back to notions of like, don't go when the Israelites go into Canaan and they say, don't do as the Canaanites, don't do the things that the Jebusites and the Hivites and who else do we have? What are the other Canaanite groups? Some of these, the Amalekites, all these different groups that the Israelites are at war with, and that they're instructed to not, mingle with and not do as they do. Well, what were they doing? I remember asking this as a kid. What were they doing? Like, what were they doing that was so horrible that that the Israelites felt that they either had to exterminate them through genocide, or at the very least needed to not mingle with them. And so what I've uncovered in my research and what I've just sort of sussed out is that these are indigenous traditions and these are indigenous people. And this gets to the next theme I'm going to be developing my next article, which is that this is the distinction between farmers and shepherds. So Cain and Abel are a farmer and a shepherd. Cain is the wicked farmer who murders the virtuous shepherd. Now, the Israelites are all shepherds, right? And shepherds and shepherd kings is an expression you see throughout, not just with the Israelites, but all over Mesopotamia and all over the ancient Near East. The various Mesopotamian leaders would describe themselves as shepherds and shepherd kings. The Hyksos called themselves the shepherd kings. And they separate them and they distinguish themselves from the farmers. And when I listen to scholars talk about this, they notice that everybody notices that Cain and Abel are a farmer and a shepherd. That is not an insight. That has been readily observed. But I haven't really heard anyone, maybe I'm just missing it in the research, but I haven't really heard anyone describe why that matters. Like, what is it? Just because they've got different vocations? These are different jobs. Like, one's a bricklayer and the other's a carpenter. Like, why should anyone care that one's a farmer and one's a shepherd? Unless it does matter. And if it does matter, then why does it matter? And what I think is going on here, and this is the theme I'm going to be developing, is that the shepherds are the ruling class. They are the militant, patriarchal ruling class that came in with bronze weapons and conquered the indigenous peasants, the indigenous peasant farmers. And so when you see farmer in the Bible, they are the poor folks. They are the working class. These are the conquered. And so whenever people describe themselves as the shepherds, they're the rulers. They're the conquerors. So it's upper class, lower class, ruling class, and working class. And when you see the laws being written, it's all another thing that scholars readily observe is that everything that gets written from the time that writing gets invented in Mesopotamia and Sumer around, it's the first writing is around 3200 BC, but that's just for accounting and it's not for storytelling. By the time it becomes storytelling, it's more like 2800 BC, something like that. That everything that's being written is being written by the ruling class. People know, everyone's, scholars observe this. And scholars observe that we don't get the voices of the peasants, because they're illiterate. They're not writing things down, and they're not the ones writing down the laws. So all the laws, everything that we see getting written is patriarchal. The law is all patriarchal. The ruling classes are all patriarchal. And this, sort of leads people to, leads people to believe that it's always been patriarchy since forever. But actually, not necessarily. The peasant class and the ruling class can have very different societies, even though they're living right amongst each other. I mean, we see this in America. You see this in certainly in slavery days when the African American slaves and the white ruling class, the slaveholders. I mean, they are living in the same houses, right? It's a very intimate relationship. Geographically, they're sharing space, but they are have entirely different cultures, totally separate, like oil and water, like oil and vinegar. They are totally, even though they are physically interacting with one another, all day, every day, they're basically different societies or different subsectors of society, right? And so I think that's what's happening. That's what I think that's what I think farmers and shepherds are. Shepherds are the ruling class, the patriarchal ruling class, and farmers are these indigenous peasants that still have these older matriarchal hunter-gatherer, but Neolithic traditions of egalitarianism, of matrilineality, and of sexual freedom for women. And there's plenty of evidence that in Mesopotamia that there were that you see in terms of matrilineality, you see both types of families observed in Sumerian writing and certainly in Mesopotamian and Akkadian writing, that there were definitely still families with matrilineal bloodlines in Mesopotamia. And that the farther back you go in history, the more of it you see, the more of the matrilineal stuff you see. And so it's sort of like third millennium, second millennium, first millennium. Or else you could also say Sumerian is the farthest back in time, where the goddesses are given the most respect and the goddesses have the most power. And you see a class of women that are designated legally, that are independent of men, that they Rimtu women that are live outside of patriarchal structures. They're not subject to their fathers. They're a protected legal class, and they have sexual freedom. And they're almost always described as prostitutes. And the scholarship, and certainly in the Christian scholarship, they're always said to be prostitutes. They're described as whores. Well, you see the same thing in the modern world. Oh, any woman that has sexual freedom and engages with multiple lovers outside of marriage is called a whore. She's called a whore to this very day. Well, if you've got an entire culture that is matrilineal, an entire culture that's indigenous, and they're not bound to the same sort of sexual ethics that we have in the patriarchy, then from the patriarchal biblical perspective, the entire society is whores, or all the women are. And that's exactly what we see the Hebrew prophets talking about. Exactly what we see in the story of Hosea and his wife Gomer. She is a woman of adultery. She goes out and has children not by Hosea, and he names them not my kids. That's the name he gives them. I mean, are you familiar with the story of Hosea and Gomer there in the Old Testament?
Yeah, I mean, vaguely. Yeah, I think, isn't he instructed by Hashem to marry a prostitute?
Yeah, either by Yahweh or somebody. Yeah, he's told him, go marry a woman of adultery.
Yeah.
Now, she may be a priestess, or she may just be a Canaanite every woman. It's not really clear. But either way, it doesn't really matter. She's a woman, in my estimation, who is living by these. It's this culture clash. This is the culture clash coming to a head. And Hosea is saying to his wife, I'm going to make you stop doing this stuff now. And we're going to shut down your traditions. We're going to shut down your festivals. And we're going to make you live by my rules. And that is what's going on. And so in the third millennium BC, there's a lot of it going on. Second millennium BC, so you get the Sumerians, and then the Akkadians defeat the Sumerians, and Akkadian language comes in the second millennium, and that's the language they're speaking in both in the southern Babylon and also in the northern Assyrian cultures are both speaking Akkadian. These cultures are way more patriarchal than the Sumerians were, but they're not. But they still have a lot of this sexual freewheeling behavior still going on. And when Sumerians celebrated it, the Akkadian language speakers they're calling it into question. And then when you get to the first millennium, in the third stage, they're shutting it down. They're shutting it down altogether, so to speak. It actually still continues to a certain extent, and it continues into the modern day outside of civilization and indigenous people. But as far as the Bible story is concerned, and as far as the Israelites are concerned, this is a culture war that's going on in the First Temple period. The cult of Yahweh is this, very patriarchal shepherd king group that is having a culture war, a religious reformation, a new era of leadership and culture that is going to shut down these old traditions, and we're going to bring the women into the house, and we're not going to let them go running around doing whatever they want to do. We're going to shut it down. And I think that's basically the dynamic that's at work, and that I feel like hasn't really been explored enough in the scholarship. There's a lot of question about just how sexual these people were. There's a lot of question over whether they were having ritual sex in the temples. Again, the old Christian scholarship routinely describes orgies and orgiastic behavior, and they, use a lot of, vitriol to sort of really, insult these entire societies. And then you get some sort of modern, more feminist, more progressive scholars are saying, well, we don't really know. There's no evidence that they were having ritual sex, which to a certain extent is true. We don't have any inscriptions that say, go up to the altar and copulate. There's not like there's no specific references anywhere in Mesopotamia or in the Bible an explicit sex ritual, right?
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean that they weren't having a lot of sex in general, which is what I think was going on. I think they're just sexually freewheeling cultures, and that it makes perfect sense when you when you observe it as indigenous people. So I'll let you ask me questions if that sparks anything for you there.
Yeah. So when we look at the earliest depictions of deity, right, we're seeing the Venus sculptures, right, from prehistory, which is almost like a football shaped
Yep.
figure of a woman, right, where it's like exaggerated hips and whatnot. And then, so that's our earliest depiction of deity.
And for like 50,000 years,
Yeah.
there's maybe not 50,000, but probably 40,000 years of a continuous tradition of manufacturing these small votive Venus, what you said, the Venus figurines. They're found all over Eurasia. It's one of the most common finds um, from the Ice Age. And meanwhile, there's no equivalent sculptures for a man, right? It's just these Venus figurines. And the three really main pieces of culture we see from the Ice Age is cave paintings, ritual burials, and Venus figurines. Those are the things that we see going back to like 40,000 BC um, that we see a lot of, and we see them continuously. And it's a great point about the Venus figurines because that tradition continues right into Israel. Like we see it.
Mhm.
So the whole area of the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East, we call the Middle East. So from Egypt up the Mediterranean coast into Anatolia and then down into Mesopotamia, this U-shaped Fertile Crescent is where that's where the Neolithic Revolution happens. And so these are the oldest. That's where they invent agriculture, and that's where they had the very first settlements, the very first planting communities that became the first settlements. They transitioned from from being hunter gatherers into having settled communities, and they continue making these Venus figurines all the way through the Neolithic, right into ancient Israel, and then and we find them in archaeology. They found loads of them in ancient Israel during the First Temple period. Thousands and thousands of these little Venus. They find them in people's homes. The artistic style changes over time, but the fact that they're making these small figurines of women, that is a continuous tradition. And then when you get to the moment under Hezekiah and King Hezekiah and King Josiah in the like the 8th and 7th and 6th centuries, when they start having the reforms, that's when they stop making these figurines. Like right when they shut down the mother goddess worship is when because this is all about the religion of Asherah, the Israelite mother goddess, the Canaanite mother goddess. When they shut that religion down is when they stop making these figurines. So it goes to figure that the art goes with the religion and speaks to these cultural practices I'm describing.
Yeah. And it's interesting where, now we have the Jewish God, and you're not supposed to depict him at all or anything divine.
Right.
And you wonder where it's like we have the sculptures of this, Venus figure. And then we go to no depictions of the guy, which is a little bit, you wonder what's going on there.
I think there's probably a few different things going on. I mean, they're shutting down the Venus figurines for one, but then I think there's probably an intellectual movement around, because I don't think there's any just one. I don't think this is the only thing going on in the Old Testament. I think there's a lot of things going on with the cult of Yahweh, and I do think that there is an intellectual movement around a more sophisticated depiction, a sophisticated notion of the divine, not just like, ooh, there's a sky, so there's a sky god. There's a river god. There's a mountain god. These sort of like very simplistic notions. I do think that they're getting more sophisticated and moving towards a more intellectual depictions of the divine. And so, but I think both things are going on.
Yeah. And what do you think? Why are things shifting? I mean, so things work a little bit differently under indigenous societies, though. Like, why the shift from?
Well, one thing I talk about is it's clearly related to the advent of civilization, what we call civilization in the 3rd millennium BC. And so that's when we get rule by kings, class society, slavery, sort of ongoing warfare, permanent armies, a much more sophisticated, diverse professions. So it's all wrapped up together. But I think one of the things that I observed is that there's a technology shift with the invention of bronze. Bronze gets invented around 4000 BC. And this is a really, I talk about this is in the article I just wrote.
Mhm.
Um, this is a really profound technology shift that I think is every bit as profound as the Industrial Revolution in modern times, and that it really changes how people live. There was a huge shift with the Neolithic Revolution, and then a huge shift with the Bronze Age. And because with bronze, a couple things happened. Planting, planting had always been women's work, and it was kind of rudimentary. Women could do it close to home with the babies around, and the men are going off hunting, and the women are doing simple planting. But with the invention of bronze, that brings in agricultural tools. That brings in the plow specifically. And with the plow, now you need a beast of burden to manage it. And you also need bigger fields. So that shifts it from women's work to men's work. Um, and this changes agriculture from planting into farming. And farming becomes men's work, whereas planting had been women's work. Also, and I think it's probably even more important, is it gives us the invention of weapons. Now, there had always been spears and clubs. Now, they predate Homo sapiens. Like Homo sapiens are 250,000 years that our type of hominids have been around. But other types of hominids, you know, uh, Cro-Magnon being one, but there's, lots of others. Australopithecus, that's not my expertise, but there's all these different
Mhm.
types of near humans that had been around for 2 million years. Um, and they first started doing spears like a million years ago and doing fire as well, like a million years ago. So fire and spears go back way, way, way before Homo sapiens. And spears were equally available to everybody. So nobody would have had, not anyone, no single tribe would have had, a systemic advantage over other tribes. If your tribe had more men, then sure, you would be stronger, but, you didn't have a technology advantage. Um, but bronze does give a technology advantage. Now, with bronze swords or with daggers, a small group of ruthless men could come in and basically murder an entire tribes worth of men in a rival tribe, and they could force the women into subjugation and slavery. And I just read this book, The Creation of Patriarchy by Gerda Lerner, and it's a classic feminist history. It came out in the 80s, I guess. And I was a little nervous when I read it because I was like, man, I hope this isn't contradicting me all over the place, because I'd already sort of worked out my thesis. And I was really relieved to see that actually she's saying all the same things I was saying, and I hadn't even read her book. So that was like, wow, good. Um, and she makes the point that I hadn't realized, that the very first slaves were women, and that you would murder the men, steal all the stuff, and and also at this point, the Neolithic settlements had become prosperous enough that there was probably something worth stealing. Um, but mainly they had women to steal. You certainly could always steal the women, and and for a very long time, they only enslaved women, because they didn't really have the means to control the men. You don't really keep the men alive because they're a threat, and they didn't have either the physical means or the psychological means to control them as slaves. It's actually not that easy to keep people as slaves. You might be surprised, but people don't like it. They resist slavery, and you got to have some work for them to do. Otherwise, why are you going to keep them around? So it takes a while. So for many centuries, I don't know, I'm not sure exactly the dating, but certainly for many centuries, maybe in 1,000 years, they only kept women as slaves, and they would kill the men. And women are a lot easier to control because all you have to do is threaten the children. And so the women, they're not, it's not just that they're weaker, but the women will sacrifice themselves to protect their babies. And so if they've already got children, they will be docile to protect the children, or you just impregnate the women, and then, and again, you control them that way. And then you reward certain women with benefits. They become the upper class women, and so some women, are able to buy in and they get benefits, and they will be given the other slave women to be their handmaidens or what have you. So a certain class of women will buy into the whole thing. If they're rewarded, they get exchanged for they're controlled sexually, but other than that, they get material benefits. They get protection from, the rival, warring tribes elsewhere. So certain women will buy into it. And so for a very long time, only women were enslaved and all the men were just killed off. After a while, they come up with, they literally have to invent chains, right? Chains is another thing that we see in the Bronze Age, because they didn't exist. You can, ropes will only get you so far with holding somebody captive, but chains and shackles, you can kind of keep somebody down. And so it's in this era that we see the rise of kingship. And what is a king? A king, by our modern standards, is just a warlord. He's a guy who can command an army and lead them into battle and win a battle, and reward his troops with all the booty and with all the women, right? So kings are warlords, and so it's only in the Bronze Age that we see kingship, slavery, armies, and ongoing warfare, and it just slowly and steadily builds over time, because it doesn't take long for people to figure out that if the other guys have got daggers and swords, then you better get yourself some daggers and swords too, and you better form an army to protect your possessions and your women. And so all the power starts to shift to men, and it upsets the balance of the delicate balance of power between the sexes gets upset. This is my thesis anyway, but it's certainly true that we see, by around 3000 BC is when we're seeing kings come into place, and we're seeing kingship become the norm. And then the kings start writing laws, and they start establishing their cultures, and it's all patriarchal, and all the ruling classes are always patriarchal. But that does not mean that 100% of all the population is patriarchal, because much of the population is still these indigenous peasants, who haven't, who are living farther afield or what have you, or, they acquiesce to being conquered, but the cultures don't turn over right away. And there's plenty of precedents for this, because we see it all the way into the Middle Ages, deep into the Christian era in Europe in medieval times. The peasant peoples were still maintaining pagan traditions. They were patriarchal at this point, but they weren't like Christians, and they weren't strictly Christian. In Middle Ages Europe, there was tons of paganism all over Europe, but it was among the poor folks. It's among the peasants out in the sticks, out in the boonies, in the ruling classes in the cities. They enforce these kind of patriarchal rules very strongly, but it's not enforced. They were enforcing Christianity very strongly, but out in the boonies, who's to say, And so we saw the paganism continue in Middle Ages Europe in medieval times. And I think that's just what we're seeing in Mesopotamia and in Canaan in biblical times, is that you've got these different classes, as I was saying, the indigenous farmers and the ruling class shepherds. And so, they commingle, they know one another, they interact on a daily basis, but they don't necessarily share the same values. And they might not like each other. That's the other thing. I think that they're rivals. So I think we're seeing a lot of this in going all the way back to Abraham. So in Abraham, if we want to, we can talk about Abraham now, because this is actually a really important part of the story. Abraham and Sarah, as well as Jacob and his wives, Rachel and Leah, are living these matrilineal cultures. And, I didn't make this up. Gerda Lerner talks about it in her book. There's a lot of scholarship on this stuff that Abraham and Sarah don't live together permanently. Abraham and Sarah are actually brother and sister. How does that work? How does it work that they're brother and sister? Well, because they don't share the same mother. They have the same father, but they don't have the same mother. And clearly, in that era, it was okay. Now, eventually, this would go away, but in that era, apparently, it was okay that if you have different mothers, since it's a matrilineal culture, they're not concerned about it. They may have even been from different tribes. Abraham's father may have been impregnating women in different tribes, and so they were aware they had the same biological father, but no one was concerned about them marrying one another. And so,
yeah, wasn't that that was something that Abraham made up, that they were brother and sister, right? When they were.
There's two different times when this comes up. It comes up when they go to Egypt, and Abraham tells Sarah, "Tell everybody I'm not your husband. Tell everyone that you're my sister." And the reason being so that they won't murder Abraham and steal Sarah away. But Sarah in these cultures is an independent woman. So people typically say that because then she goes off with the Pharaoh and it is sleeping with Pharaoh and gets all sorts of gifts from Pharaoh and comes back with all these gifts, and the Pharaoh gets upset when he finds out that they're actually married and says, "Hey, what's going on? You said that she was your sister." And he said, "Well, she is my sister. I married my sister." and it happens again. There's another story where it happens. And the same thing happens where they get upset. But both times, Sarah is, it's generally regarded that people generally read these stories as Abraham like pimping out his wife. I don't actually think that's what's going on. I think that Sarah is acting as an independent woman who is free to sleep with whoever she wants and free to receive gifts from them. And that there's simply no problem with that at all. That what we call prostitution, they wouldn't have considered prostitution at all. I think there was just a culture of gift giving, that they're sexually freewheeling, and that if you want to give a woman a gift, she's free to receive it, and she's free to receive as much gifts as she wants. And apparently she brings back a lot of gifts from Pharaoh because Abraham and Sarah leave there quite wealthy. And so what I think is going on is that they're just leaning into their matriarchal culture, and Sarah's a free agent and she can go do whatever she wants, sleep with the Pharaoh, get gifts from the Pharaoh, and then go about her business with no obligation. And I think that's all that's going on. Sarah's name actually means chief. She's a matriarch. The root of Sarah is Sar, and that is a Semitic word for chief. It's actually still to this day, in Semitic languages, the root for like a chieftain. So Sarah means chieftainess. And so she's this matriarchal figure. And apparently, she was a catch. She's a fine woman. And so, people are happy to give her some gifts to get, some time with her. And so I think that's what's going on with Abraham and Sarah, and that these stories where he pretends to not be married to her so that she can be a sexual free agent is an aspect of these matriarchal cultures. Later on, when Sarah dies, Abraham has to go visit her because they hadn't been living together. And again, that's a matrilocal marriage where it's a visiting marriage. And then in the later generation with Jacob and his wives, Rachel and Leah, he goes and lives with the wife's family. There's a bunch of examples of this. Samson goes and lives with his wife's family who are Philistines. Gideon goes and lives with his wife's family that are Canaanites. There's a bunch of examples of it, and they're all in the older parts of the storyline. And it speaks to these older traditions that are eventually going to be wiped out, but they don't get wiped out overnight. It takes 1,000 years, 2,000 years. And it's reflected in Mesopotamian law from these eras that there are women that are observed as being non-patriarchal, and that they're a protected legal class. but it goes away eventually. And so in the third millennium BC, they're celebrated. Second millennium BC, they're being challenged. First millennium BC, they're being shut down, and they're being shut down by the Greeks too. Greek mythology is totally contemporary to the Old Testament Hebrew mythology, and they're going through the same cultural shift as well. And this will be a theme of my book that in some of the Greek mythology, they're doing the same thing. They're going to shut down these older tribal indigenous traditions and replace them with patriarchal law, and the law favors the men.
Yeah, how would it favor the men?
Because they write it.
No, I mean not what would motivate it, but like in what respect does it favor the men?
I mean, all the property rights are all, women lose their property rights, and and especially, and it's most readily observable in sexual behavior when they start to enforce, virginity and patriarchal bloodlines, and they're not enforcing that in the older parts of Mesopotamia. The women are completely sexually freewheeling. There's and the goddesses, the most popular goddess of the Bronze Age is Ishtar. She's Inanna. So again, this is the same transition. She's Inanna for the Sumerians. She's Ishtar for the Akkadians, and she's Astarte in the Old Testament. Same goddess. It's all the same Venus tradition. She's the queen of heaven. She was the counterpart to the king of the gods, but not her husband, not his wife. And she's a prostitute. And they absolutely put women's sexuality on full display, and they celebrate it. Ishtar is totally and wildly promiscuous. And this will be one of the major themes I'm developing, is that, and she is not submissive to any male figures whatsoever. She steals power from the male gods. She does not listen to them. She does not submit to them. She sends her husband, Tamuzi, to hell. These are not patriarchal goddesses. And then when you get to Astarte in the Old Testament, they call her Ashtoreth. That means shameful. The ETH means shame. Shameful Astarte. Why is she shameful? Because she's a whore. She's the whore of Babylon. That's where the word comes from. Ishtar was literally the whore of Babylon. And it was celebrated. Her sexuality is on wide open display. She's a porn star by our standards. And the liturgies and mythologies are graphically sexual. And they use all these farming metaphors. Who will plow my vulva? Who will plow my vulva? Plow my vulva. It's a sexual thing. And the sex isn't just for the women either. The male gods are sexual too. Rain is considered semen of the gods. The bull of heaven is plowing, pouring his semen all over Mother Earth to impregnate Mother Earth. That's what rain is. And they do have these rituals where they're trying to, bring down the semen of the gods. I mean, that's what a rain dance. And so male and female are both very sexual in these traditions because, these are fertility religions. They're agricultural religions. It's all about making the plants grow. And they believe that sex makes the flowers grow. And so everybody can't be having enough sex. And they're very, very sexual cultures. And they celebrate it. They put it in their art. Mesopotamian art is full of graphic sexuality. There's multiple goddesses that are graphically sexual, that are talking about, what do you give me for, my sexual services? But Ishtar especially is like really, really sexual, and she's the most popular goddess. Like I just don't think you can downplay the fact that the most popular goddess for a few thousand years is wildly sexual, and then they shut it down. And the only way that makes sense is in the context of these sort of indigenous matriarchal cultures. It's the only way it makes any sense at all. And because if they'd been patriarchal, if they'd been controlling paternity back in the Neolithic, there's no way they would have ever had these kinds of goddesses on display. They never would have been doing it because they wouldn't have been letting their daughters, go behave this way. And this is why the Hebrew prophets are saying, are so up in arms about it. They're really concerned about it. Like, you've got to stop doing this. You've got to stop letting your wives and daughters be adulterers. Your sons and husbands are, practicing adultery with your neighbors' wives and all this stuff. And all the children are illegitimate. Well, really? All the children of the entire society are illegitimate? No, they're matriarchal is what they are. That's what's going on. And this is a big part of the culture war. I don't think it's the only thing going on, but it's a big part of it. It's a really big part of it.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of ways to think about that. You wonder if, well, so, you'd mentioned like God being thought of, or like the man God being in the sky, right? And then
The Heavenly Father, yep.
the fields are female. And so, we
We
wonder.
still call her Mother Earth today.
Yeah. Yeah. And so you wonder if originally we thought of the deity as female because it's close, right? It's not like the sky, which is far away.
Exactly. Yep.
And kind of as we progress, like we're in Greek times, right? And we have like Platonic and Gnostic thought, right? And so like just like even now, right? God exists outside of time and space. So he's like way out there. Right?
He's out there forming the cosmos. He's not near at hand, right? He's distant and far away. While this is an important point you're bringing up, because it's a common theme all the way through, right up to the Virgin Mary in Catholic traditions, which is that the goddesses they're close. Asherah she's very actively involved, while El, the Sky Father, is distant and far away, and it's his son that rules. The one thing that in the Indo-European traditions, they've got a Sky Father that's like the creator of the universe. It's On, and then Anu. It's On for the Sumerians, Anu for the Akkadians, and then for the Canaanites, it's El. It's all just sort of one long tradition. That God he's distant. He's not close. But his son is the king of the gods, and he's the storm god, and he rules. So it's Enlil for the Sumerians, it's Marduk or for the Babylonians, and Ashur for the Assyrians, and then it's Baal. It's Baal for the Canaanites and the Israelites. And so another one of the themes I'll be developing is that Baal was the existing incumbent king of the gods when Yahweh is introduced. So the God of the Bible is actually two separate gods originally, which is why we have two different words in the Bible. We have God and the Lord. God is Elohim, and Elohim goes back to El, Israel. El is the God of the Israelites. That's what Jacob says. Jacob is the one who gets the name Israel, and he goes to the town of Bethel, which means house of El, and he builds an altar. This is in Genesis, and on the altar he writes the words in Hebrew, El Eloi Israel. El is the God of Israel, because they didn't know Yahweh. They didn't have Yahweh in those days, in the second millennium, in the Bronze Age. Yahweh comes along with Moses. Moses introduces Yahweh at the burning bush. And there's two different scripture texts. I don't have the verses in front of me, but there's two different ones where in Genesis, where Yahweh says, I am the God of your fathers, but they did not know me by this name. I am Yahweh, and they did not know me. And there's no evidence of Yahweh in the Bronze Age. There's loads of evidence of El. There's loads of evidence of El all over the place. They know El was archaeologists have found tons of evidence of El all over the place. But Yahweh doesn't appear until the Israelites go into Canaan, which is around 1200 BC, 1250 BC. In that time period, during the Bronze Age collapse, that's when Yahweh appears on the stage. And that's when I believe this cult of Yahweh gets kicked off, originally as a warrior god, in the context of all the chaos of the Bronze Age collapse. but it becomes this patriarchal reform movement. And all the way during the first temple, I think Yahweh and El are still totally separate gods. The Yahweh is just another one of the sons of El, and Yahweh comes on and he's competing with Baal. He's competing to knock off Baal and replace him as the king of the gods. And that it's the whole first temple is pagan. The whole first temple, the Israelites don't know, they wouldn't have no idea what you're talking about. If we went back in time to see what they were doing, we would barely recognize anything. Assuming we could speak the language, we wouldn't recognize what they were doing at all. It'd be totally pagan. There's no Torah. The laws, haven't been formalized yet. Moses didn't write the Torah. The Torah is not written until after there's not even a Hebrew language at 1200 BC. The Hebrew language doesn't even get invented. There's no evidence of a Hebrew written language until the 900s, till the 10th century BC, 9th century BC. So I think that Yahweh is at least becomes this reform movement, and that, you can almost say that Moses, to the extent he may or may not have existed, who knows, but that I liken him to like this Martin Luther type figure, that he kicks off this Reformation that plays out over centuries, where they want to change the traditions. And it's a bloody, heated, fraught affair where they're really having a really huge dispute. And it doesn't play out overnight. It plays out over many generations, and it's hard fought. That's what I think is really going on. And that I will talk about child sacrifice. I don't think it's an appropriate conversation for right now, but Baal, I think, is a child sacrifice tradition. And that's another one we're fighting about, is a group of the Yahweh reform cult is opposed to child sacrifice. And that the religion of El is a child sacrifice religion. And this is one of the things that they want to change, and one of the things that they're fighting about, and one of the things that they're still doing in the first temple. And this is what the Hebrew prophets are every bit as upset about child sacrifice as they are about women's sexuality. But that's another conversation for a different podcast. I'm going to write a whole book about that, so we can have that another night.
Yeah, and along the lines of the goddess tradition and hints of it in the Old Testament. That part in Proverbs where it's wisdom incarnate, speaking about herself.
So go ahead.
Well, I was reading that, and it sure reads a lot like, if you're familiar with Thunder Perfect Mind.
Oh yeah.
Right. And so you wonder, like, it seems a little bit unusual because we have the sky being associated with the man god, or the masculine god, right? And Thunder Perfect Mind, that's one of the ways that she identifies herself, as thunder, which is unusual because Yahweh is supposed to be the god of thunder. That's a very masculine thing. So you wonder, like, what's going on there. And
so I talk about this in my first book, that King Solomon is credited with writing Proverbs, whether he did or not, leave that aside. But he's one who's credited with it by tradition, and he is highly criticized in the Book of Kings for all of his goddess worship. He's an Astarte, where he's a worshiper of Astarte, and he's got all these wives and concubines, and he's clearly a very sexual guy. He's clearly a lover of women. Song of Songs is the only romantic sexual part of the entire Bible, certainly of the Old Testament, and it's the only part where a woman is really given a voice. Is Song of Songs, and again, it goes to King Solomon. And as you point out, in Proverbs, wisdom is she, and she says, "I was with Yahweh, and I guided Yahweh's hand to guide to lay the cornerstone, the foundation, the cornerstones of." I'm getting the text wrong, but anyway, lay the foundation stones of creation, right? And so this is where I said in my first book that King Solomon is the one who transmutes these pagan goddess traditions into these traditions of what becomes Sophia. Sophia is the Greek word for wisdom. And so, and Sophia becomes this sort of goddess to a certain extent. And it's the one aspect of the feminine divine that still carries on in the monotheistic traditions, is that the feminine is wisdom. Well, these old goddesses were totally goddesses of divination, prophecy, wisdom, all this stuff. That was all related to wisdom, because the women are smarter. The men are stupid, men are dumb, and women are smart. There's a whole Grateful Dead song about that. The women are smarter. So it's being a bit facetious, obviously. But the women are related to wisdom, and women did divination and prophecy for the most part in the ancient world, generally speaking. There are male shamans too, and this is where we get into the transgenderism. Transgenderism is a big part of these traditions. There was trans people have always been with us, and so in the ancient world, men would castrate themselves in service of the mother goddess, and they were a class of priests that we see all over the ancient Near East. We see them in Sumer. They're the Gala priests in Sumer. They are you've got all these terrific names. They're the Galai priests in ancient Rome of the goddess Cybele. They are the Megabyzi of the goddess Artemis at Artemis of Ephesus, which was the biggest temple of the ancient world, was the temple of Artemis at Ephesus in Turkey. They're the Megabyzi. The Scythians are the nomadic horse lords. They're big time goddess worshippers in matriarchal culture. Their priests are called the Inari, and then they're in the Bible. So the Kadesha which the name means the holy ones, because the word Kadesh means holy, and so the Kadesha are the holy ones, and they are the ritual prostitutes, what we call ritual prostitutes, but we don't really. Again, it's very ambiguous about what they were really doing, but every time that they're mentioned, it's always in the context of a sexual context. And they are distinguished from a zona, which is the Hebrew word for like a brothel prostitute. Like a common tavern prostitute is called a zona, whereas a Kadesha is a holy one. She's a priestess of some context. But they're a bit of an enigma because we don't really have a lot of detail about what precisely they were doing. But we know they were midwives, and we know that we can infer that there's some sexual stuff going on. And so the Kadesha in the Old Testament are the prostitutes, and then the Kadesh are their male, presumably transgender counterparts. And we see them getting chased off. There's 3 times that they're mentioned. There are 3 verses that mention Kadesh, the trans, and the scholarship I've seen likens them to the Galai priests of Rome. All the old Christian scholarship always says that these fellows are like the Galai. And we know they don't like them because every time they're mentioned, they're getting chased out. The only times they're being mentioned is when they're being chased away in the context of reforms, in the context of Josiah and Hezekiah and King Asa, who was a little bit earlier. They chase them away. But they don't chase away the Kadesha because the women are a little bit, they've got more cultural power than, these transgender priests who probably even in those days were probably somewhat marginal fringe characters, socially speaking. You can imagine, first of all, there's just not that many of them. There are very few in number, and they're like these effeminate men dressing in women's clothing. So you can imagine that these, macho, patriarchal soldier types don't think too much of them. They certainly don't think too much of them in modern times. So you can imagine that it's the same kind of thing going on, that these macho men are chasing away these effeminate, cross-dressing transvestites, eunuch transvestites. But they're mentioned 3 times, always being chased out, and they're part of these goddess worshiping traditions. And so that's, again, speaks to these matriarchal cultures, these old goddess worshiping traditions being reformed and being shut down.
Oh, yeah, and you wonder with, we mentioned Sophia and, the Gnostics, where the kind of like what I was saying before, that, you have the monad, which he's so far away, he's in a totally different realm, and he's actually unknowable. But we
Right.
know Sophia, right? And she's actually the person that made the earth, where and the universe, right? Like, so I'm inclined to think that, just as we see Christology in the Old Testament, they're seeing sophiology in the Old Testament, right? And it's a continuation of like the sky god just being pushed farther and farther away. And there's this dual like Logos Sophia tradition,
Right.
right? And where Sophia is kind of like the redeemer, but we don't really have that in the surviving Pauline tradition, right? And so you wonder what's going on there, and if like why did our version survive, right? Where the Gnostic, you know,
Yeah, there's a lot of reasons I think to go, why the Gnostics clearly have the mother goddess, right? Their Trinity is the Mother, Father, and Sophia. So Jesus, or I mean, sorry, Father, Son, and Sophia, and that is um, a parallel to the Egyptian Trinity of Isis, Osiris, and Horus, where it's a Mother, Father, and the Son. And so the Gnostics do that, whereas in the Pauline tradition, they get rid of the mother and just have the Holy Ghost. Which, whatever that's supposed to mean. Like, even as a kid, I was like, what is the Holy Ghost? And like, where's the mother? As a kid in church, I was like, why isn't it the mother? I remember being like 6 years old. Why is it Father, Son, and Holy Ghost instead of Father, Son, and Mother?
yeah,
Uh,
yeah. I mean, with me, it's the same thing where I was thinking of like, so there's like God the Father, and he's the one with the beard, right?
right.
And then there's the Son. He's Jesus. He has a beard too, but he's younger,
He's
right?
young.
And then there's no imagery for the Holy Ghost. So I'm thinking like Casper, like it's a maybe like a figure with a sheet over it, just like as we think of a ghost. And that one seems the odd one out, where that one just seems a little bit weird, right?
It's such an unsatisfying Trinity. There's so many Trinities in pagan traditions. There's so many, countless Trinities, and Father, Son, and Holy Ghost is such a weak one.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think.
And,
Uh,
in the Valentinian tradition, they were definite that um, it was a woman. It was a female deity, right? And I think they equated the Holy Spirit with Sophia, but
yeah, I'm sure that's true. I'm sure that that's not my field of expertise, but I'm sure that in some traditions people were doing that. I have no doubt. It would make perfect sense, right? Um, the goddesses have trinities. That's Mother, Maiden, and Death, and that's who the three goddesses in the Old Testament are. Asherah is the mother, Astarte is the maiden, she's the queen of heaven, goddess of love and war, and then Anat is the death goddess, and she is a real death goddess. Um, she's got a she delights in slaughter. She bathes in blood. She's got a belt of human hands and a necklace of skulls, just like Kali of the Hindus. Um, but Anat's way earlier than Kali, and then Anat does not appear. Um, Anat is arguably really one of my favorites because she is the most powerful. This will be another theme in the book that I'm going to develop is the Canaanite pantheon, the Israelite pantheon. So El is the father, Baal is his son, who's the king of the gods. Asherah is the mother. I already mentioned Asherah, started Anat. And then you also got two, I don't know all the gods, but there's the three big male gods are Baal, Yam, and Mot. And they're just like Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades. So Baal is a king. Yam is the god of the sea, like Poseidon, and Mot is the god of death, like Hades, and they're brothers. and they're rivals. Whereas in the Greeks, they're friendly to each other, but in the Canaanite traditions, they're totally rivals to one another. But they're all friendly to El, and they're all the sons of El. But Anat is the most powerful one of all of them by far. She walks up to El, and have you read the Baal cycle story? Do you know the Baal cycle story?
Yeah, I'm somewhat familiar. She's bossing him around. I
She doesn't
think
just
it's
boss him around. She threatens to murder him. She walks up to Baal. Baal becomes king of the gods by defeating his brother Yam, and now he needs to have a temple built, but they need permission for it. So they need to go to get the permission from El, and so they walk up to El, and Anat walks right up to El and says, "You better give me what I want, or I'm going to smash your. I'm going to throw you down like a lamb. I'm going to smash your skull in, and I'm going to make your gray beard run red with gore." Like, whoa, like who talks like that? Like nobody talks like that to the Sky Father. And then he doesn't get mad. He doesn't get insulted. He doesn't say, "How dare you speak to me this way?" He says, "Oh, my daughter, what can I get? What can I do for you?" And he gives her what she wants. And she says, "Don't be so proud of your mighty house, El, because I'll just tear it down with my mighty arms." She's talking about destroying creation. El's house is the heavens. She's going to tear down the heavens if she doesn't get what she wants. How does that work unless she is the most powerful deity of all? Likewise,
she could be like throwing a tantrum. I mean, I'm thinking
he would swat her down. Look, if my daughter threw a tantrum like that, and I'm her father, and I do have daughters, if my young daughter threw a tantrum like that, I would not give her what she wanted. I can assure you, you're not going to get to what you want by behaving this way. You're going to get punished for behaving this way. And then likewise, she kills Mot. Baal and Mot go on these extended battles, 2 separate battles, and Mot kills Baal, and then Anat brings Baal back to life. How does she bring Baal back to life? By going up to Mot, Hades, the king of the underworld. She grabs him by the collar and says, "Give me back my brother," and then cuts him in half with a sword, grinds him up in a sieve, burns him with fire, and feeds him to the birds, which is an agricultural ritual, by the way. And then restores Baal back to life. And she doesn't fight with Mot. She just walks up to him and dispatches him instantly, without hesitation. There's no extended battle. Mot, doesn't even have any resistance whatsoever. She absolutely destroys them. And she kills Yam's soldiers too. Anat is by far the most powerful character in the entire pantheon because she has the power to destroy creation. And this is the power of the goddesses. Kali is the same kind of way for the Hindus. Kali and Shiva, Shiva being the male, Shiva's the destroyer. And Kali is his, I'm not going to get into a whole Hindu thing, but Kali goes with Shiva, and she's a manifestation of Parvati, who's, Shiva's wife. And so she has the power to destroy all of creation. That is, it's one thing to be the creator. That's pretty powerful, and that's a pretty terrific thing to do. But if you've got the power to destroy creation, that trumps creation, frankly. And the biblical writers, I call Anat she who must not be named, because they don't actually name her. They mention Asherah 40 times, usually as an Asherah pole, which is like this totem pole that they keep cutting down as part of the reforms. They cut down the Asherah pole and they destroy the altars of Baal. Why are they destroying the altars of Baal? Because Yahweh wants to displace Baal, right? And become the new king of the gods. And they cut down the Asherah pole because Asherah's role in all of this is she is, as we were mentioning, she's close at hand. So she's very actively involved in the lives of the people and the lives of the rest of the pantheon. She chooses the king of the gods. El stamps it with his authority, but it's Asherah. If you read the story carefully, Asherah is the one making the decision. And this is reflective. I noticed this in Native American cultures, where they will have I was saying they're matrilineal and matriarchal, but they still have a male chief, right? Like a Native American tribe will still have a man who is a strong masculine man who leads the men into battle and speaks for the tribe. But how does that man get the job? Does he take that job by force? Does he get that job through inheritance? No. A Native American chief gets chosen by the women. The women choose the man who's going to be their chief. And then the tribe consents to the decision. So it's a form of democracy, but it doesn't have like politicians and voting. But it's totally a form of democracy that was highly influential on the founding fathers. The women, the Council of Women, the whoever the leadership among the women, they choose which man among their men that they want to have as their spokesperson, as their chief, as their war chief, So that guy gets chosen by the women. That's exactly what Asherah does. She chooses Baal. She chooses Yam. She chooses, and then when Baal is killed off, Asherah goes and, picks various other of her sons to be king of the gods as a replacement for Baal, but none of them are good enough. So Anat goes and restores Baal back to glory. But Asherah is the one who makes the choice, and then El stamps it with his authority. Likewise, when Anat and Baal go to visit El to get permission to build a temple, El tells them, you have to get Asherah's permission. And so then they go and visit Asherah, and Asherah is terrified. When Baal and Anat go and approach Asherah, they describe her as trembling and shaking and being terrified that Baal and Anat are approaching because she thinks that they're going to kill her, or kill her lion, she says, or kill her sons. But they come bearing gifts, and then she's happy. And then she goes and visits El. And again, they're not living together. El and Asherah don't live together. Asherah has to go on a long journey to go visit El in his home, and say, let's do this for Baal. And El says, hey, all right. Another funny thing that happens in that part of the story is that El tries to seduce Asherah. Says, hey, lady, are you turned on by the mighty Sky Father? And she says, no, not really, not today. And he gets all annoyed. He says, what, are you just here for me to like be your slave girl to make some bricks for you? She totally passes off his seduction. And but he doesn't get mad. He's like, all right. He's like totally easygoing about it. And the women have all of this independence, all of this authority. The goddesses do. And it's really quite remarkable, And then you see these same characters in the Old Testament being, thrown down, being knocked off her pedestal, being losing their authority, losing their independence. Because if you want to have a patriarchal society, you can't have these kinds of goddesses running around. You can't have these traditions. It sends all the wrong ideas to your daughters, right? You can't have your wives and daughters will think that they've got some independence and authority if all these goddesses, if you got this porn star, queen of heaven, and this, mother goddess with total independence and authority, and this other death goddess that has the power to kill everybody, like that is not encouraging your daughters to be well behaved, right? So that's why I think, and this is the theme I'm going to be developing in the book. I'm developing in the blog, and then hopefully it will turn into a book. That's the idea. So anyone who's listening, you sign up to edwarddodge.substack.com, and I will be developing. I'm trying to get out one article a week and developing these themes. But yeah, so they've got these goddesses were going strong in the second millennium BC, and in the first millennium, they get rid of them. They get rid of them altogether. And so it just goes to show that, women have had equal rights and power and independence much more recently in history than we're led to believe. And it, male dominance of women is not just this fact of nature that goes back since forever. No, if the women stick together, mean, that's sort of the lesson. It's kind of like labor unions. Workers will be exploited unless they all band together and form a labor union. Well, what you see in these matriarchal cultures is that the women all stick together and they keep the babies. So if the husband wants access to the children, he's got to go through the mothers. They're gatekeepers, right? And, um, the women have each other's backs. They share child rearing duties. They have industries of their own. They've got money, because weaving is a women's business. Weaving was women's industry, but women make money from it. It's not just drudgery that they're doing, in the back room. It's literally manufacturing, and they're making products to sell and to export, and the women keep the money. So the women have independence. They've got wealth. They've got legal protections. They've got rights. And in the earliest generation of laws, you see a lot of it. In the little bit later on, they've got less rights. And then by the time you get to the laws of Deuteronomy that the Israelites are writing, all those rights are being taken away. They've got no rights at all. And that's what the story of Garden of Eden is that I believe, and a lot of other people believe, that Eve represents these traditions. And when they say she's the mother of all living, so she's clearly an analog to Asherah. But when they tell her that, you will be monogamous to Adam, you will only have sex with Adam. Adam doesn't have any of these prescriptions laid on him. He's not obligated to be monogamous to his wife, but his wife is obligated to be monogamous to him. That's because they're laying down new rules. And this is only in like the 5th, 6th century BC, somewhere around there, that this story gets written. And it's like, party's over, girls. There's a new sheriff in town. There's a new order. And this is how it's going to be going forward. And because it had not been that way earlier on. It's part of the transition from tribalism to kingship too.
Yeah. And that was the Valentinian understanding of the Genesis narrative, that it was actually talking about Sophia and the fall in the pleroma, right? It was metaphorical. So yeah, I don't know if you if you came to that idea on your own. That
some of the stuff I came up on my own, and some of the stuff I've been learning from other people, and it's hard to suss out where I learned it all from necessarily, because it's just like I absorb so much. And then I'll think of something on my own, and then find other people have already been talking about it. So it's like, did I think of it, or did somebody else think? It's like I find that very little. It's very hard to come up with a unique, good idea. If you've got a good idea, you can almost always find that somebody else already had that idea. And so there's that too. So like, I'll think of something and then find confirmation for it in somebody else's scholarship. So I don't know how much of it's unique to me, frankly. I'm hoping to have some unique contributions, but we'll see. I do generally find that the more I learn, the more I realize how little I know, and that somebody else has probably already talked about it before I did. So but it is gratifying when I think of something and then find it confirmed. Like when I read Gerda Lerner's book just recently, to find that she had really already laid out this stuff in almost exact same terms that I'm using. And she does it with a lot more precision, because she's like a really bona fide historian, right? She's dead now, but she was really quite a famous academic in her own right. And that book, Creation and Patriarchy, by her is really quite famous. I hadn't heard of it, but I don't really study feminists. I'm approaching this from religious studies, and her book is in feminist studies. So feminist historians are all about her. But it's where you get these silos, and you got to break silos sometimes. And so that was an example of me getting out of the religious silo and into the feminist history silo, and say, oh, wow, these people are talking about this stuff that I was just thinking about. So,
Yeah, for sure. And then, on the same lines as, Cain and Abel are talking about previous histories, that it's actually symbolic with Adam and Eve. There's also the Lilith story, which might be like a retelling of the Canaanite religion, right?
yeah,
That
so
this is
Lilith
the
is
past.
really interesting.
Yeah.
Um, so on one hand, it's a later Hebrew folk story. Like Lilith is not like old per se, not like Sumerian, not like that, Um, and she's not even biblical, right? She's not in the Bible. Um, she comes along in later Hebrew folk tales, and she is said to be Adam's first wife before Eve, and that she was not submissive to Adam, and
Mm.
she was very sexual, and so they got to get rid of her. And so it totally tracks with this whole thing that there was an earlier set of cultures and religious traditions where the women were not submissive, and the women were not gonna just they're not subordinate, they're not submissive, and they're sexually independent. Which from a patriarchal perspective is completely unacceptable, but I think from an egalitarian perspective is perfectly fine. I mean, I'm fine with it. I don't care. Um, all these people are having way more sex. So if you want to have more sex, then you're better off letting your woman be sexually independent, because the men and women are both are having more sex. When then these really patriarchal types, they shut down the sex a lot. One of my theories on the rise of Christianity is that, so as we transition in the pagan era from matriarchy to patriarchy, the women get constrained in their sex lives, but the men are not. So by the time we get into the Roman era, upper class Roman women are constrained, but upper class Roman men can do absolutely whatever they want sexually. There's no limits on men's sexuality in the Roman era. Lower class women, nobody cares what the women are doing, because they don't have reputations to defend anyway. But respectable women, are sexually constrained, while respectable men are not. When Christianity comes along, and you see this with Paul, women are central to it, the rise of Christianity. Women like Christianity in the Roman era. And I have a theory about this, and it's not something I'm going to do scholarship on. I don't write about, I'm not a Christian scholar. That's not my field. But I do have a theory about this, which is that I think Christianity is obviously a very sexually chaste culture. Jesus, I believe, is sexually chaste. I do believe that he's celibate. I do not believe he's married to Mary Magdalene. I don't think he's having sex with Mary Magdalene. I think a very central aspect of Christianity is that it is, in contrast to the Romans, sexually constrained and sexually controlled. And so I think all these upper class, respectable Roman women are attracted to Christianity because it encourages their husbands to not screw around, and encourages their husband to also be monogamous, because the women already had to follow these rules of monogamy. And now they can say, look, I want you to be monogamous too. And so they start encouraging their husbands to take part. And I think it's a really big component of the rise of Christianity is the sexual ethics. Because that's a really day-to-day thing, esoteric philosophy is one thing, but you're not going to win over, these cultural movements aren't built on esoteric philosophy. They're built on much more practical day-to-day things, day-to-day behaviors. That's what people are fighting about. The Civil War in America was not fought over, some, high-minded philosophy of states' rights. It was fought over, can you keep slaves or you not keep slaves? And then the philosophy develops after a cultural battle. Same thing with child sacrifice. Stop sacrificing children. How dare you tell me to stop sacrificing children? We've been doing this for centuries. The gods demand we sacrifice children. So they have a fight about it. there's one group in this temple over here, and the temple across the street, they're doing the opposite, and they hate each other, and they're fighting about it, and they're having disputes. They're in modern day, they'd be writing editorials in the newspaper, but in those days, they're having, they're going to get up a soapbox, so to speak, in the town square and have an argument. Prophets are arguing in the in the town square, like literally giving speeches. Jeremiah is giving speeches in the middle of town, telling people to stop doing the stuff that you're doing. Amos and Hosea are telling them, stop doing all these things you guys have been doing. They developed a philosophy later on to justify the the cultural behaviors that they're trying to impose. So they want to shut down child sacrifice. They want to control the women. And it's only later that they develop this high-minded philosophy. They're not spilling blood over philosophical disputes. Like, who cares? People could give two shits about philosophy. Most people are too dumb to even understand what these philosophers are talking about anyway. These esoteric notions of the nature of the divine. This is only a concern of a very small segment of the population. But, when you tell the women, you're not allowed to receive you're not allowed to receive gifts for having sex with your neighbor, the women are getting all pissed off. They're like, fuck you. I've been doing, my mother did it. My grandmother did it. My great grandmother did it. Why should I stop doing it? I happen to like these gifts and I happen to enjoy the sex. So why should I stop doing it? Because we're going to make you stop doing it with force. We're going to lock you down. We're going to slap you upside the head. We're going to beat you. We're going to punch you in the face. Literally. We're going to beat you up and abuse you and enslave you, what have you. People are fighting. I really think that these fights about the prophets are over much more practical stuff. They're not. I don't think that they're fighting about high-minded philosophy. I think they're fighting about, behavioral things, and that the philosophy comes later.
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense. Especially, I mean, if you're going to create a story and create a narrative, like with Yahweh becoming the supreme deity as opposed to Baal, I think that's all retroactive, right? So all these things are like this. There's a societal change, and then there's the philosophy that
justifies it.
Yeah,
and that sort of they what's the right word I'm trying to think of? The word escaped me that I'm looking for. But anyway, the philosophy, it's like we write the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution way after the Revolution, right? All men are created equal. They didn't fight the Revolution with the British over the idea that all men are created equal. We fought a revolution with the British over taxation, right? And over, military matters and business and commerce matters. We fought a revolution over really practical things that affect people in their day-to-day lives, not some philosophical idea of all men are created equal. Like, who gives a shit? Like, that sounds nice, Tom. Thanks for the idea. But like, I'm not going to go fight a war over this theory you just came up with there, Mr. Jefferson. I'm going to fight a war over the British trying to take gold out of my pocket. That's worth spilling blood over, that's worth fighting about. These troops on my land, I'm going to fight a war over that. I'm going to kill or be killed, to get rid of these troops. You know what I'm saying? And so I think there's this really practical culture war that's going on. And that's really going to be the main theme that I'm going to be developing is this, that the child sacrifice and the sex stuff and just sort of patriarchy in general are really what they're fighting about. And that the real objection to Baal is I mean, he's part of these fertility traditions too. Baal is very much a feature of these sex traditions. And it's not just about women being sex objects, it's male and female characters together participating in the sex. But when you want to control the women's sexual behavior, you got to get rid of these rituals altogether. Um, and so Baal represents, he's the king of the gods for a child sacrifice tradition. Um, and another part of it is that the sacrifices are being made to El, first of all. We'll have to talk about this another night. They're being made to El, they're not being made to Baal. Baal is the king of the gods in that culture. But the sacrifices are actually being made to El. And so when you read the Abraham and Isaac story closely, Elohim is demanding the sacrifice. Yahweh provides the deliverance. Yahweh does not appear in the story until Isaac gets substituted with the ram. Yahweh provides the substitute, but Yahweh does not demand the sacrifice. El demands the sacrifice. So I think another part of what's going on is they want to sort of rehabilitate El and create him, sort of reboot El, right? It comes like comic books or James Bond, we want to we can't keep telling this old Sean Connery versions of the James Bond story because that just doesn't fit with today's culture. We need to have a Daniel Craig version of the story. So we're going to go back to the beginning. We're going to retell his origin story and, reboot him for the 21st century for our modern way of thinking. You see this in comic books. How many times has Batman's story been retold, his origin stories, or Spider-Man's origin stories retold? They get retold with every generation to modernize it, right? So I think they needed to modernize the Sky Father and get rid of these atrocious child sacrifices. There's also other stories of El that he's deferential to the women. He's also got another story where there's another one of the Baal stories or the Canaanite stories where it's called El's Drinking Party. It's a short story. El gets so drunk that he shits and pisses himself and has to be helped home by Astarte and Anat. Or no, he gets helped home by some other gods. And then Astarte and Anat come by in the morning and find El moaning, with his hangover. And they give him a hangover cure, which they call, I shit you not, they call it the hair of the dog. Interesting, right? In this, from 1200 BC, from Ugarit, a hangover cure called the hair of the dog. So that's where that expression comes from, apparently. Who knew?
I'm going to have to look that up.
Yeah, if you find, I'll show you the book. If you haven't read, this is the one I use. There's other translations. Yeah. Stories of Ancient Canaan. Mark Smith is one of the most renowned biblical scholars. He's still around. Michael Coogan, too. But Mark Smith, I'm a huge fan of. And this book has the Baal cycle. It's got another story about Anat called, I forget what it's called. It's Akkad. It's called Akkad. And in that story, too, she goes and threatens El and says she's going to smash his skull in and make his gray beard run with gore. I'm going to throw you down like a lamb. That's not trivial stuff, man. If you're going to throw down the Sky Father like a lamb and smash his skull, that's a special kind of deity right there. But there's this short story. It's only about 1 or 2 pages of El's drinking party where he gets so drunk that he urinates and defecates all over himself. So that's kind of an embarrassing story. That's not a very respectable Sky Father, We need to reboot his origin stories and get rid of these old nasty old stories and get, some new stories a little more respectable. That's a theory I have of what's going on. I think that, so yeah, I think that the Yahwists, the followers of Yahweh, I agree with a lot of what they're doing. I frankly do. I think they take the patriarchy a little too far. I think they go overboard in getting rid of the goddesses. I really think that that's a little unnecessary to get rid of them altogether because the Greeks don't. The Greeks water down the goddesses and they take Ishtar because she becomes Aphrodite. So Inanna, Ishtar, Astarte, Aphrodite, and then the Roman Venus is all one long tradition, but each culture tweaks the stories a little bit for their own purposes. And she had always been the goddess of love and war. And so she's a sex goddess, but she's also a war goddess. And so she's always wearing battle armor and she's quite fierce. She's also a goddess of divination and prophecy. But when you get to the Greeks, they kind of split those powers up and they gave the war powers to Athena. The powers of war and divination and war and wisdom, anyway, we should say, go to Athena. And Aphrodite is just the goddess of love and sex and prostitution. And she gets really watered down. And she's no longer the queen of heaven. That title goes to Hera, who is now the model for an appropriate patriarchal wife. She is totally subservient to Zeus, who goes around having philandering affairs all over the place. And what does Hera do when her husband philanders? Does she punish Zeus? No. She goes and chases the women. All these poor human women that Zeus has been raping, Hera goes and chases them and punishes them too. So Hera spends all of her time chasing around the women that Zeus has been having sex with to punish them. She becomes this model for that marriage, the marriage between Zeus and Hera, is the model for patriarchal marriages right into the modern day. We see the exact same thing with Hillary and Bill Clinton, where Bill Clinton is, king of the gods, so to speak, running around philandering as much as he wants, grabbing every piece of tail he can get his hands on. And what does Hillary do? Does she punish Bill? Hell no. She punishes the women. She punishes Monica Lewinsky. She punishes Jennifer Flowers. She punishes all these other women that would dare come out and speak about the fact that they slept with Bill. They all get punished by Hillary. And Hillary never punishes Bill, not publicly. She probably gets something out of him behind closed doors, but that's why men buy a lot of diamond rings. But yeah, we see that they model this sort of patriarchal marriage of the subservient woman right into the modern day. It's a total Mad Men type scenario. And also another one about the Greeks is that the whole tradition of the dying rising god goes to that had been Ishtar's tradition too. That goes to Demeter and Persephone, and that story gets sort of reordered. The main sex god becomes not a woman, it becomes Dionysus, who's a gay male character, and he becomes the main sort of center point for promiscuous sex, is no longer a woman. They don't want women. They don't want to model women being sexually promiscuous, but it's okay for a gay man to be sexually promiscuous. So Dionysus, who's totally this effeminate gay character, he becomes the center point for all the sort of sex orgy stuff. And not Demeter, not Persephone, Aphrodite to a certain extent, but even Aphrodite is not really promiscuous. She is a little bit, but not really. But she embodies sex and she embodies love and eroticism, and she is the patron of prostitution. So the Aphrodite temples are the prostitution temples in Greek times. But Aphrodite herself, her sex isn't really, kind of is, but really watered down compared to Ishtar. She's nothing like Ishtar. Ishtar is like Jenna Jameson. She is like a full-on porn star.
Yeah. All right. So here, maybe, do you want to hit up a question here?
If you got questions, listen.
All right. So we got 40
viewers here.
How's that?
Do we have many viewers here? I can't see any of that, so I don't know. I have no idea. I'm just talking to you, Elliot.
Yeah, there you go. Let's see here. Let's fix my camera. All right, there we go. Okay, so 48 Walsh. Interesting point on the Neolithic Venus figurine. So this was kind of earlier on. Do you have any plans to do a show? Oh, okay. I thought this question was originally to you. To do a show on, or maybe it is, I don't know, on the origins of religion or the work of Jacques Chauvin.
I'm not familiar with Jacques Calvin.
The Gods and Symbolic Thought.
In my first book, I go into this from sort of intuitive perspective. It's not perfect scholarship, but I sort of follow all these themes. So in my book of History of the Goddess, I get into it a little bit. But that's not, the new book is going to be Bronze Age going forward. And it really is like 3,500 BC to 500 BC is going to be the new book. So it's not the birth of religion. That's outside of my scope. But Elliot, I'd highly encourage you to get someone on to talk about it.
Yeah, it's a thought of mine, like, something I wonder about, like the origins of religion, which actually predates humans, that we had religion as Neanderthals.
You think? Is there anything with the Neanderthals?
Yeah, so there's evidence of Neanderthals burying, like a religious burial.
Okay.
And I don't know, I might be off, maybe I am, with the Venus figurines used by Neanderthals.
That is a good question. I actually don't know the answer to that. Did Cro-Magnon or Neanderthal, did they good? I always sort of assumed it was just the Homo sapiens, but I could be corrected on that. I actually don't know the answer to that.
Yeah.
I just know we find a lot of them. That's all I know.
Yeah, and just because
I never did any digging, but
yeah, it's really interesting. And the whole, where does Yahweh come from? What does the name even mean? Like, is it like people say it means like the one that is, right? Or I am, right? Or it could also mean to blow, meaning like wind. Yeah, we just don't know. And
yeah, I mean, there is apparently there appears to be somewhat convincing evidence of Yahweh as a tribal god with the Shasu, I believe is their name, in the Bronze Age, earlier than the entry into Canaan. But in terms of the Israelite story, it's all from like 1200 BC going forward that Yahweh becomes like a relevant, like a political force, right? Like, like a cultural movement, or at least as far as like relevant to us. So as far as I know, Yahweh, I liken Moses to, 1250, 1200 BC. The Minerva Stele is 1209 BC. So I think it's somewhere in that time period. And that's certainly when the Israelites go into Canaan, because the traditional dating on that is, traditional dating for the Exodus is in the 15th century. So like 1400, 1450 BC. But that doesn't make sense historically, because Egypt was firmly in control of Canaan until the 1200s BC, or until the 1100s BC. So if the Exodus was 1450 BC, then you have to account for what they were doing for 200 years until Egypt's control over Canaan started to come apart in the Bronze Age collapse. To me, I think it's pretty clear, and most scholars, I did not invent this. Most scholars put the Exodus in the 13th century, not the 15th century, so 200 years later, and as a function of the Bronze Age collapse. That and that's when Egypt's political power starts to break up, and then it makes sense, because then it makes sense that there's a lot of fighting going on. It's a very chaotic, anarchic time. This is what they're describing in the time of the judges. And so it makes sense to place the judges' time period during this Bronze Age collapse time period. And then we know that King David takes Jerusalem around 1000 BC. Like that's, like, I think that's a pretty good date, like 1004, 1006, something like that. It's like in the first decade, but for practical terms, you could say 1000 BC. And even if King David presumably did exist, because there's a house of David, we certainly know the Israelites took Jerusalem around that time. Like, that's not in dispute.
Sure. Very good. All right. So maybe let's see, maybe, let's see, do you want to leave it there?
Yeah, I think
Or-
we're coming on 2 hours. I think that's probably been pretty good. And but it's been terrific. I feel like I've said my piece for tonight. There'll be more material, more topics in this whole discussion as I move forward. That was, coming off of this week's blog post. So next week, I'm going to develop the farmers and shepherds will be my next theme, and I'll be getting into the Mesopotamian mythology and talking about, the Epic of Gilgamesh and stuff, and developing the idea that the shepherd kings are this ruling class lording it over, conquering the indigenous peasant farmers. That's going to be the theme in my next piece, and then we'll get into the some of the Sumerian stories about Inanna. It'll probably be the Sumerian stories about Inanna will come next, probably, and then the Epic of Gilgamesh after that.
Very good. Yeah, it's been interesting. I think we've tied a lot of things together. And yeah, thanks so much for coming
No,
on.
thank you, Elliot. I appreciate it. It's always nice to come on. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, everybody, for watching. And yeah, have a great rest of the day, everybody.